Dr. Hunt, dear friends, it is really a great honor for me to deliver the Tillich lecture. I have had the honor and the pleasure of delivering many famous lectures throughout the world, in places like India and Pakistan, England, Scotland, Europe itself, and many places in America. But I feel especially close to this lecture because I knew the name of not only the name, but the person after whose name this lecture series has been named very well, both as a graduate student at Harvard in the 50s, and especially when I was visiting professor here at Harvard, 61, 62, which was the last year of Professor Tillich. And at that time, he was in a phase of his life during which he was very much interested in interreligious dialogue and what I call crossing religious frontiers. And on several occasions, we had a long tete-a-tete talk together on this issue. As you know, it was, in fact, in 1962 that, or 1961, that his Bampton lectures were published by Columbia University entitled Christianity and the Encounter of World Religions, which echo the great interest of Professor Tillich at the end of his life, after having visited Japan extensively and after having carried out very profound religious dialogue with Shinichi Hisamatsu, the famous Zen master, concerning Christian-Buddhist encounters and dialogues and exchanges. And this gradually spread in his mind to other religions. And although Islam was the closest neighbor next door to Christianity, both geographically and intellectually, it was to Islam that he turned after his encounter with the Far Eastern and South Asian religions, that is Buddhism essentially, and after that to some extent Hinduism and Shintoism. Therefore, when invited to lecture in his name, I thought that I would choose a subject which I think would have been close to his heart. Although, of course, to cross a religious frontier poses the question, which frontier are you crossing and in which direction? The effect that the crossing of the religious frontier has upon us is determined by both these factors. The effect is not always the same depending on where we come from and where we are going. And in fact, the few minutes I have with you this afternoon, well, I would talk about this subject as a kind of echo of the concerns of Professor Tillich, but from the other side of the border, you might say, from someone who, like him, has also crossed religious frontiers more than once in his life, and has also studied in depth the influence that such a crossing can have. Let me say at the very outset that the crossing of a religious frontier does not only mean studying other religions. If one does not study other religions, qua religion, it is possible to catch a boat and go down the Danube River from Austria through Romania to the Black Sea and end up in Istanbul. If one is not at all interested in languages, what difference does it make that you're going from German-speaking to Romanian-speaking to Turkish-speaking lands? You're enjoying the water. Much of this crossing of religious frontiers, so-called, in the study of religion, is precisely that kind of crossing. That is a crossing that tries to understand other religions in terms of everything except religion itself, in terms of anthropology, linguistics, philology, sociology, even meteorology, archaeology, you name it. Any logic that you have, you can always study religion in terms of that. But that is not the study of religion in itself. What concerned Paul Tillich, of course, being the great theologian and philosopher of religion that he was the interest in other religions, qua religions. And it is this precisely which joins my interest to his, although I come from somewhat of a different background, and both philosophical, of course, and religious theological. In the last essay that he wrote in his life, which is quite telling, the last essay, major essay that he wrote, there were a few small things afterwards, called The Significance of the History of Religions for the Systematic Theologian. This, of course, is a particularly Christian term. This term does not have its equivalent in Islam or even Judaism or Hinduism. It's a particularly Christian term, but it has its corresponding function, you might say, within those other universes. He writes that in crossing these religious frontiers, and I want to quote him, there are 5 different influences and transformations that take place for the person who takes this crossing of the border seriously. And he says, first, one must say that revelatory experiences are universally human, which is, of course, very problematic for me, but at the same time, it shows that a man of the stature of Tillich was able to see that there were other human beings who had received revelation other than his own world, the Christian world, which itself was a major step that Tillich took, later on taken also by certain Catholic theologians, but not completely, like Hans Kung, with whom I've had many debates, once on this campus and once elsewhere on this subject. The second, that revelation is received by man in terms of his finite human situation. The third is that when the systematic theologian assumes the significance of the history of religions, it involves the belief that there are not only one particular revelatory experiences throughout human history, but there is a revelatory process. Fourth, that there may be, but not necessarily must be, a central event in the history of religions. And fifth, the history of religions in its essential nature does not exist alongside the history of culture that is within it. I quote this extensively in order to show how, in fact, the crossing of religious frontiers is determined precisely the country from which we come, who we are, the religious tradition from which we hail. I, as a person who knows a little about Islamic thought, would say that, in fact, it's not the experience of revelation that is universal. It's revelation itself. That is, religion is not only a human response to a given truth from heaven, the religion itself is given from heaven. And therefore the rites, the doctrines of a religion are sacred. They are not simply man's response to the sacred. This is a major issue in which I have differences with many leading Protestant and Catholic theologians today, especially John Hick, the famous British Protestant theologian who has written a great deal on this subject. And I mention this here not to be contentious, but to show how, in fact, delicate is the question of the crossing of these religious frontiers if one takes religion seriously, and how you have consequences of both a theological and a religious order. The reason I'm using theological as well as religious is precisely to show that by religion I do not mean just anything that is studied on a purely social level. It has theological consequences, otherwise this would be redundant. But throughout my lecture, when I mean religious, I also always mean the theological element being present. In fact, it was Paul Tillich who once said in one of his lectures, he says, to be seriously Christian is to have to be concerned with theology. Because there were many people at that time at Harvard who wanted to separate theology from religion, having become tired of theological discussions and the like. They didn't want to identify the two together. But of course, in the Christian context, and the word theology in English is impregnated with Christian meaning, because I'm speaking English now. If I were to speak Arabic, I would not use the word theology once in my conference this evening, but that's another set of vocabulary set of words. But in English, theology is when you take religion seriously as related to God, to the transcendent, to the sacred, and not only its external manifestations. Now, to follow upon the wake of what Paul Tillich tried to achieve before I come to my own response to what these consequences are for us, I think that anyone coming from the Western background and trying to cross religious frontiers and take religion seriously, as did a man like Tillich, first of all, has to pose the question, which has not been answered completely even now, although Professor Tillich, in his famous discourse with Mircea Eliade from the University of Chicago, had a very important discussion about this, is, first of all, what do we mean by the history of religions vis-a-vis the theology of religions? To reduce the study of other religions to the history of religion is to destroy, in the minds of many, what one could call the historiality of religion, rather than its historicity. There's a big difference between the two. Of course, Heidegger had already used this word and reinterpreted the word Geschichte in German in the sense, but it's not so familiar in the English language. we have no choice but to be historial in the sense that we exist in a temporal sequence. And it's interesting that Tillich was not at all a historicist. For him, an event in history, what attracted him was its own dynamism, its own reality. But when we say the history of something today, especially when we study religion or philosophy, it is the reduction of a thing simply to its temporal change. That is, it's a negation of the immutable and the transcendent. And one of the great tragedies, I believe, in all modern education, even in the best of institutions, such as where we're standing now, is that in the humanities, we very rarely study anything. We only study its history. In the sciences, we study the thing itself. You're studying chemistry, you just start with chemistry 1, here's valence, acid, base, and so forth, and maybe you study a bit of history of chemistry later on. But in the humanities, you don't study anything in itself, especially in philosophy. You're presented with the whole history of philosophy as certain opinions historically determined. Of course, this is the very powerful impact of Hegel and Marx upon all of Western thought, which even people against this point of view have not been able to totally negate it. There have been movements in Europe against it, but it's still very much with us. And I think one of the great contributions of Tillich was precisely to point to this issue. But for us today, several decades after he functioned, it is important to ask ourselves the question, when we talk about the history of religions, what exactly are we talking about? Why? Of course, there's a whole inner history of the word Religion Wissenschaft used in German, of the phenomenology of religion, Eliade's opposition to the history of religions, at the same time constitution of this term, the University of Chicago, which has influenced the study of other religions to the extent that to talk about other religions is to study their history, which itself, of course, is very problematic theologically. It is very important, I'm not denying it, but I think the whole issue of the study of other religions, qua history of religion, vis-a-vis theology of religion, and the study of realities of which the historical manifestation is only a historical manifestation and does not exhaust those realities, remains a very central issue. The special attention paid in the West to the study of the history of things, including the history of religion, in place of studying the thing in itself, because of the philosophical opposition to the very idea of being able to study something in itself, going back to Kant, this, of course, has left its effect upon the study of other religions in almost all Western universities, and still does so today. For example, the relationship between Christianity and secularism, the several centuries during which gradually, from the medieval synthesis, various fields of human endeavor separated themselves from the Christian roots or Christian framework and declared their independence. Of course, the word secularized Latin, and we had it before this period, but secularism as a philosophy that everybody knows about was a gradual phenomenon which took place step by step. And many Christian thinkers, even those who are theologians, look upon other places in the world looking for the same historical experience, trying to find the same pattern, and trying to carry out a dialogue with not a reality, but a process with which they themselves are familiar. And therefore, this rabid search for secularism, for all these books written on my own tradition, Islam, about Islam and secularism, where in so many instances the word does not have that meaning at all. Like saying, for example, that royal palaces were secular architecture in contrast to mosques, where this was totally absurd. Royal palaces were as much really religious architecture as mosques, where in many cases you can't tell the difference between the two. This idea of division is something which carries over when you go over the frontier from the Christian side to other religions because of the experience, the particular experience which Christianity has had during the last 5 centuries, which other religions in the world, including Islam, have begun to have only since the last century, and some places even less, and therefore they do not have the same attitude toward this process as we have in the West. A question which I asked Professor Tillich, and which I think we should still all ask ourselves, that has to do precisely with these specific conditions of crossing religious frontiers from a particular spiritual country into another, is that why is it that this great interest in the history of religions began in the West, in the Christian West. Even Judaism in the West didn't show too much interest until later. It's a very important question to ask. If this is itself part and parcel of being religious, why is it that it began in the Christian West and not in the Christian East? I mean, have you read any important books in Bulgarian on comparative religion? And Eliade was a Romanian, but he wrote his books on comparative religion in Paris. He began to write in French and later on in English. But the whole of Eastern Christianity, like the Islamic world, like traditional India, and like the rest of Asia, Buddhist and Confucian Asia, somehow did not show that much interest. And this is a very important question which I think is close related to where we come from in crossing religious borders, and has everything to do with the destruction of the total space of Christianity within the Western mind by secularism. When Christianity filled the whole space, there was not the same need as when some of this space was emptied, and there was need of studying other religions. The deep need of many Christians for ecumenical studies itself is a very telling fact about the processes whereby a particular religion places itself in a situation vis-a-vis other religions. Also, in the light of this, it's interesting to know that the two countries in Asia which have had any noticeable interest in what is called comparative religion or history of religions are India and Japan, and that for completely modernistic reasons. The Japanese began to do this after they tried to become more westernized than the Westerners. And in the same way that in the Kant conference in Germany, I will joke, just 2 years ago, 200 anniversary of Kant, a few years ago, there were more Japanese scholars than German scholars presenting papers on Kant. In the same way, of course, you have great specialists in Japan on ancient Egyptian religions and so forth and so on, but that is not part and parcel of traditional Buddhist or Shinto culture of Japan. And the same with India, was part of Indian nationalism, which to some extent, not completely, but to some extent secularized Hinduism, of trying to say that they're very much interested in other religions than the Arya Samaj and Brahma Samaj, and from those movements gradually, movements grew in India, which was part of the philosophy to be all-encompassing, and therefore a certain number of people developed interest in other religions. But in other parts of Asia, this did not come about. And this again has to do with this question which I posed at the very beginning, that when we cross religious frontiers, where do we start from? Who are we? How do we cross the border? So if a Muslim crosses into the Christian world, and if a Christian crosses into the Muslim world, the consequence of this crossing is not the same, depending on the religious situation at that moment when one is crossing the frontier like this. Now, if this is the case, then why should we cross religious frontiers? Why should we cross religious frontiers? Why do we have to study other religions? This is not an irrelevant question. There are many in this country, the so-called religious right, evangelical groups and the like, who are very much opposed to the study of other religions. They're closed. You say, why should we bother with this? Especially in Christianity, where emphasis was put for 2 millennia on the fact that Christ alone saves, that there is no salvation outside of the church. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus was a doctrine of the Catholic Church and still has not been officially dropped. And therefore, why bother? This is a very important question. I think the question of expediency aside, that I shall speak about a bit later, I think the question is much more profound than that. That is, the very situation in which human beings live today leaves us no choice. In the same way that there are very few people who do not travel today geographically as they become modernized. Traveling has to be modernized people. If you're traditional Indian living in Kerala, you don't get in a plane and go every weekend to visit your uncle in Bengal or in Iran. This is a specialty. As one enters in the modern world, there is more external mobility and travel. The kind of inward need of traveling, of seeing other worlds, and especially this encounter with other religions at its highest level, which did not take place very often. There are occasional exceptions like India and Spain in what Europe calls the Middle Ages, but was not a common experience, has now become much more of a common experience. So there is no way of avoiding this, what I consider to be the only real new intellectual adventure of modern man. I consider this to be a much more exciting adventure than getting into a piece of metal and going to zooming around space and then settling down again. This is really traveling into a spiritual space which transforms us and transforms the world about us, and which is an extremely difficult journey to make. So the fact that this is necessary, I want to emphasize, and this is a fact that Professor Tillich came to after a long, long time. After a long time. He once said something very profound. He said that all these years I was doing, that is, writing on Protestant theology, there was always for me this other which I had to react to. It was a challenge for me. Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx, existentialism, modern art, social sciences, this whole secular world out there. But he said, now I realize there's other, which is not the secular world, but is other religions to which I have to turn. In fact, one can say that the experience of us living in this moment of history presents us with three domains outside of our own religious world, which is the other, because normal humanity doesn't need more than one religious world. So you don't need more than one family to be happy. You don't need 10 families. One family is enough for human beings. You don't need other worlds. There are three other domains with which we're forced to come face to face with, at least if not all of us, many of us. First of all is the secular world, which denies the reality of religion. That we're faced with all the time. And Christianity came face to face with that several centuries before other religions. And it's that to which Tillich paid so much of his attention and devoted so much of his energy into the last few years of his life. Then there is the cosmos, the world of nature, which the very process of secularization had torn away from the bosom of religion in the West and made the other, the it, which now religion has to contend with, and if we don't, we'll not be around to talk about other issues very long. The environmental crisis will destroy everything. It's not a joke, and cannot be solved with cosmetics. It's a very profound issue. And third is other religions, other sacred universes. And the late Paul Tillich had spent so much of his life dealing with the first other, turning later on in the last decade of his life, I would say, to the second other. He never really had time or energy to turn to the third other, that is to develop a theology of nature, which now so many Christian thinkers have to deal with the situation being what it is. But in any case, he took this very important step in the first domain, and the step he took, which when we look upon it now 40 years later, was not just a personal choice. It was really a visionary step, because he realized it had to be taken. There was no choice. The necessity, what I call the necessity of crossing religious frontiers, is there whether we like it or not. And that doesn't mean for everyone. That doesn't mean for everyone. The same way that not everyone has to learn quantum mechanics in order for physics to flourish in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But the few who do have to do it. It's the many that lead ordinary religious lives and perhaps never have to think of a bhikkhu or a Brahmin or a mullah or something like that. But for the people who think, who are the intelligentsia, who lead a society, who are at the same time are interested in religion and the future of humanity, this is something very difficult to avoid. Now, this necessity at the same time poses very great challenges. And here I come to my own really responses to these questions. The first is that I believe that every religion is complete unto itself. Otherwise it would not be a religion. It would be against God's justice and God's mercy to send a complete religion to me and a half religion to my neighbor. I therefore reject completely all evolutionary theories of religion. If one believes in religion, to say with Max Muller that the Upanishads were not false, but just a little boy compared to the New Testament, which is a grown-up man, is of course to speak against God's mercy. Because how could God be so unmerciful as to have sent a as yet ungrown little child to one part of the world and a completely grown-up child to another? So the question of the completeness of religion, I insist upon as a person who takes religion seriously, otherwise religion has no meaning. Religion must either transform us completely, must encompass all that we are, or it is not religion. It's in the nature of the sacred to ask of us all that we are, as Friedrich Schwann said so beautifully. That is the nature of the sacred, to encompass all that we are. At the same time, there's within every religion a sense of absoluteness. No matter what philosophy department said that we should not use the word absolute anymore, it's a very meaningful term, and I shall continue to use it. Because we know innately something which is absolute, something which is totally itself, has no need of anything else, is not modified by anything else. Like when you say, are you absolutely sure? There's no doubt, there is nothing missing, it's only pure certitude. There's something absolute in every religion, otherwise nobody would follow it. They must have a certain sense of absoluteness. Now, these pose, of course, very profound problems. What does it mean, therefore, to cross a religious frontier and go into another religious universe? As I said, not as that Danube tourist looking only at the water, but as a linguist on that boat who's studying the change of language from German to Romanian to Turkish. I'm just giving this example that is really interested in studying what is happening as you cross the religious frontier and you come into another religious world, whether it's going from Christianity to Islam or to Buddhism or to Hinduism or Judaism, Zoroastrianism, you name it. There are, of course, three possible attitudes at first. One is to say, well, I crossed the religious frontier and I came into a complete different other religious universe. They seem to have different values, different ways of looking at things, different forms, different rites, and they seem to be prospering, and they themselves are completely sure of themselves, and they have the same strong faith in their religion as I have in mine. Therefore, all of these things must be relative, they must be man-made, and this was a response that was given by Bayle already in the 18th century, the French materialistic philosopher, and especially expanded very much so by Karl Marx and the whole of the communist Marxist critique of religion, besides being its opium of the people and so forth, opium of the people, was precisely its diversity being the proof of its relativity, and its relativity being the proof of its non-divine origin. So this is one possible attitude which has many takers. Many people have, in a sense, had their faith shaken by virtue of crossing that religious frontier. The second is to cling to one's own religion and say, only my religion is true. That is, I possess the religio vera, the true religion, or vera religio, they're both correct. And Tillich shared that and talked about that. He said, I can no longer do that as a Christian. Saying all other religions are false, only my religion is true. But that is an attitude which is to be found throughout the world, among Christians, among Buddhists, among Muslims, among Hindus. And that should not be criticized so much, because that is the normal situation of humanity. We were not born to live on two planetary systems. We're born to live in one planetary system, which the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening, and that is our sun. I've always used this image, that the fact that we've discovered other solar systems, other suns, does not mean that our sun is not for us the sun. And in fact, we cannot live normally without believing that this is the sun. If you go around thinking all the time there are all these other suns and planets are going around, it will go mad by midday and they'll take us out of society into some lunatic asylum. So our very sanity depends upon having this single sun. And this works also for religion. You cannot expect everyone in a religion to say, well, let's say, I am a Buddhist, I love the Buddha, but I must also love Krishna, I must also love Moses, and so forth and so on. This is not the possibility for everyone. But nevertheless, it is a very, very important challenge, because if I say only my religion is true, then again I am faced, as St. Thomas Aquinas was not, and medieval thinkers were not, with the reality and the possibility of losing my own faith, because it's very difficult to negate when one sees something of an authentic spiritual character, then to negate it and cling to one's own. If one is a jeweler and say, I know exactly what jewelry is, I have a very beautiful diamond ring on my finger, and sees another diamond and says, well, this is not a real diamond. If he does that, then his own finger negates this being a real diamond. It's a very, very dangerous situation, and it's led to a great deal of contention, a great deal of also confused thinking, and it's got everybody scrambling about what to do with this issue. And this is a especially difficult issue for Christianity. For example, much more so than Islam, because Islam, by virtue of coming at the end of the prophetic cycle, accepts all the great religions before it. I just said something a few days ago, which news we published backwards, and I received many calls about Jesus and according to Islam. You may have seen that issue of Newsweek, which had the cover of Christ 2 weeks ago. And I should never interview journals. Once in a while they find my weak moment, and I accept. And there I said that Christ will die as a Muslim when he returns. I first said Muslim means totally surrendered to the will of God. And it's in the sense that Christ will die as a Muslim. And I received letters, hate letters, telephone calls, and so on. So one has to be very careful about what says. In Islam, in the sense of surrender to the will of God, because that's all that Islam means, it means surrender to the will of God. Islam sees as being the condition of other religions before it, and therefore accepts all the great prophets of the Abrahamic line, and by extension other prophets. There's nothing in Islam that doesn't say that Confucius or the Buddha were not great prophets. And in fact, local Muslims of those regions claim that, even if in Algeria people didn't think of Buddha as the prophet, Muslims in India have written about that, and Muslims in Persia, when Eastern Persia was still Buddhist at the beginning of the Islamic period, wrote about that. The word Budh, which in Persian was turned into Arabic, Bud in Sanskrit is the same as Aql, same as the divine intellect, and the Buddha was a prophet. I've read many things along this line myself. But for Christianity it was especially difficult, because the whole of salvation history is concentrated on a single divine manifestation, which is that of Christ. And I sympathize very much with my Christian brothers and sisters how difficult that is. But nevertheless, it's a position that's not very easily tenable. And Professor Tillich was one of the first outstanding theologians of the 20th century to have realized that. The third possibility is, of course, to say that all religions are true, but the consequences that follow from that. This was what came out of the idea of the Theosophical Society of the late 19th century and Western occultism, and to some extent a form of Hindu modernism, because the Theosophical Society went to India. Not traditional Hinduism, but certain type of Hindu modernism, in which discernment was put aside. And a kind of sentimental, let's all be brothers or sisters came about, which was bereft of any intellectual content. And therefore, especially the Western academic study of religion turned against it very, very strongly. Very strongly, to the extent of saying, in fact, there is no relation with religions, there's nothing similar between them, this kind of thing. But there's another way of understanding this, and that is to understand that religions possess an inner meaning and an outer set of forms. It is on the level of the inner meaning that they have unity, and on the level of outer forms that there is diversity. And therefore, to say that all religions are true just in a certain kind of least common denominator is to both to destroy the sacred quality of the forms, the rites given in various religions, and also at the same time to destroy all that is different, which adds to the wealth and richness of the spiritual diversity of the human family. That is, of course, what we call the traditional point of view, which is also my own. But I want to emphasize very much here in this quest for religious understanding, the one important point that also Professor Tillich alluded to, which cannot be overcome, must not be forgotten, is the question of the truth. Although, since Whitehead really died, truth is not a favorite subject in the philosophy department here, but nevertheless, it's the motto of this university. Let's see if we can talk about Veritas. But if you can say if everything is true, nothing is true. If there's no error, there's no truth. Even in mathematics, if the solution of a problem is whatever you give, there is no solution to the problem. The truth also always implies error. And one of the great problems that Tillich also faced, and many, many Christian theologians and other theologians from other religions have faced in this crossing of religious frontiers, is how to create a relationship between love and truth, between the love of the neighbor and truth. And the position that I love you, I know you're in error, but I love you, is not sufficient. This is to a large extent the position of many Catholics vis-a-vis Islam right now, and vis-a-vis Judaism, to the extent that one of the rabbis, when His Holiness the Pope was in Palestine and Israel just a short while ago, he said, please stop loving us so much, which is really very unfortunate in the sense, not of course of not loving, but first of all, you have to accept the other side as having the truth. If he's just in error and we love because of error, that's not going to solve the problem. And Tillich was, to his great credit, was one of the first Christian theologians, because he was a philosopher also, who understood the question of truth, and that just simply the question of sentimentality is not going to solve the problem at all. Anyway, these are very major challenges which are posed when you cross the religious frontier. And I believe that the solution to these challenges is to come back to the sense of absoluteness in religion without being able to lose the sight of the absolute with a capital A. I've written for years on this relationship between the absolute with a capital A and what I call the relative absolute, and that also a term used for the first time by Friedrich Schwann. I owe it to him. I always want to pay my debts to those to whom I owe debts. It is he who used this term, first of all. I was very astounded when I was going over some of Professor Tillich's works, preparing this lecture. I came up with a quotation by him that I want to read for you. He first of all said there are a number of absolutes. And he says there's the structure of the mind, there's the unconditioned character of the moral imperative, and there's agape or love. For him, these are absolutes, and I shall challenge that in a moment. But then he adds, we found that all the absolutes with a small a pointed beyond themselves to the most basic absolute of all, to being itself, beyond the split of subject and object. In finding being itself, our research has reached the ground of truth and of the good, the source of all the other absolutes in our encounter with reality. This source is the absolute with a capital A itself, and the experience of the absolute itself is experience of the holy, the sacred. You could almost hear Meister Eckhart singing hallelujahs in the other world, having heard this. This is that tradition in which it comes. And as a Muslim thinker, I could not agree more with this assertion. That is, Tillich places the absolutely absolute, absolute with a capital A, in the ground of being, in the Urgrund of German mystical theology, Teutonic theology, and mysticism, and not on any level of the manifestation of that absolute. Those are absolutes with a small a. The response to this, from myself, would be yes, only the absolute is absolutely absolute. That is, everything else except the absolute, the fundamental ground, the fundamental principle above all distinction, including all theophanies, all hypostasis, all names, all forms, is the absolutely absolute. And to absolutize anything else in an ultimate way is to make the crossing of religious frontiers impossible. That is, what we're doing then is to take a particularity and putting it in place of the ultimate absolute. Only, to speak a Christian theological or Muslim theological language, only God in himself is absolute. But in place of the three small absolutes that Paul Tillich mentions, that is structure of our mind, the unconditional character of the moral imperative, and agape or love, I believe these appear to a Christian thinker, especially of his stature, to be absolute with a small a. But they do not necessarily manifest themselves or are to be seen in the same way in all religious universes. I would comment upon this by saying that when we cross religious frontiers, we must and we will face these lower levels of the absolute, or our conception of the personal God. We leave out the Tao, we leave out Shunyata, we leave out half the world. It has to be at such a level that it really accords with the absolute in the philosophical sense that Tillich understood it, coming from the Romantic tradition of the 19th century, which really understood the sense of the absolute in itself, although Hegel already mangled it somewhat later. But in the tradition of German philosophy, that sense of the absolute, I would agree with completely. And the greatest danger in crossing religious frontiers is to look for what we conceive that absolute to be on the formal plane of our own religion, other religions. That's why Tillich, after coming back from Japan, he said we should never ask the follower of another religion, what is your conception of God? We should not start with that. we should start with the question, what is your conception of the telos of human life, the intimate meaning of human life? Translate the Greek word telos as intimate meaning of human life. Let's start with that. And I agree fully with him. But that is the first and most important question for a metaphysician and a person concerned with comparative religion. Secondly, the question of revelation. For every religion, revelation is what brings the message of the absolute. And within that world, it is absolute, like that sun in our solar system. The sun is a sun in the galaxy, the sun in our solar system. And again, to be able to distinguish this relative absolute from the absolute absolute is the most difficult thing. For example, in the Christian mind, the Father and the Son are fused together for many people. They cannot conceive of God without Christ. Christ is God, which means that then He cannot be the void, cannot be Allah, cannot be Brahman, and so forth and so on. And also the way that the divine manifests itself is not always the same. It's very interesting. I might say God's creativity is such that it never repeats itself. Metaphysically speaking, the infinite can never repeat itself. In the same way that in mathematics, an infinite series is one in which nothing is ever repeated, otherwise it would be a series. Metaphysically, the divine does not repeat itself by virtue of its infinity. And therefore, you have different forms of prophecy, you have different forms of manifestation. In some religions, you have actual descent of the truth, like in the avatars of Hinduism or in Christianity. In other places, in fact, the receiver of the truth is the messenger. He is not the truth itself, he is the receiver of it, like in Islam or Judaism. In Hinduism, the remarkable religion, has so many different possibilities. That other possibility also exists within it. Sometimes it is the message which is sacred. Sometimes it is the messenger, as in the two sister religions of Islam and Christianity, so close and so different on this issue. For us, it's the message, the Quran, the Word of God, which is the central theophany of Islam. For Christianity, the Word of God is not the Bible, it is Christ Himself, and He is the central theophany. So you have to have this art of being able to locate where the particular theophany on this highest level of the manifestation of the religion actually holds true in a particular religious universe. Another very important issue in which we're dealing with the absolute in itself and the small absolutes. In every religion, the means of salvation are absolute. Otherwise, the religion would fall apart. But the means themselves are not the same. The soteriological aspect of religions are never identical. Yes, there are general practices, general virtues which have remarkable similarities in their inner meaning. But actually, what saves is not the same in all religions. But there is no religion without salvation. To see somebody says that there is no salvation in Islam because there is no salvation history. How many times have I read that? Then why in the world do I say 5 times a day, Hayya ala salat, Hayya ala falah, that means call into salvation? And if I'm not saved by saying the prayers, why waste all the energy on my back bending up and down? And the same with the Buddhist and the Hindu. And how can such a thing be? Every human being wants to be saved. It's not only Christians who want to be saved. Everyone wants to be saved. And if a religion cannot offer salvation, it will not last. It's the meaning of how that is carried out, which is different, and the means, which is quite something else. The same with spiritual rites and techniques. In every religion, salvation also implies certain rites, R-I-T-E-S. In America, we spell rights in only one way, R-I-G-H-T. We have nothing, and the other one doesn't matter. They are all for rights. But there's other rights. And according to all religions, those are given by God. A man-made right is only good for anthropologists to practice. It's not for religious people. For a religious person, he or she believes that that right is given by God. It's a boat sent from the other side to carry us across the water of this life. And therefore, we cannot do it by ourselves. It's remarkable how there is no religion without rights, but the external forms of rights are so different. It's the inner meaning that brings them together. And the same with the spiritual techniques, the inner spiritual rites practiced by those who are following an inner path, like yoga or tasawwuf, Sufism, things like that, which are remarkable homologous resemblances. At the same time, they're not identical. You pronounce in Sanskrit in India, in Arabic in the Islamic world. You do certain postures physically in India, which you do not in the Islamic world. You have the Hesychast tradition of the particular breath and keeping the name of Christ in your heart, which is very different from what you do in Zen. But nevertheless, you always have it. That is, you have rites on two levels. The rites for salvation, you might say the rites for deliverance. That is the actual release from all limitations of existence, which the inner paths of religions pursue. Then there's the question of the cosmos. What role does the cosmos play? In some religions, the theology of nature is emphasized more than in other religions. In some religions, there's a vast discussion of how the cosmos originated. And in some religions, not at all. It's remarkable, these two sister civilizations, China and India, they're geographically sisters, but religiously so different. I say over jokingly, you can tell one civilization which one can eat everything and the other one can eat nothing. As far as dietary laws are concerned. But in China, you have the great religion of Confucianism, in which there's total silence about cosmogony. And then you have the Rig Veda, these beautiful hymns of the sacrifice of Purusha and the creation of the world, and very, very elaborate discussions. And it doesn't mean that every religion has to reveal the same doctrine of the cosmos as far as origin and end are concerned. God has the prerogative to reveal different things in different religions. But there's no religion which does not have a doctrine about the cosmos. The great tragedy in the West was that the cosmos was taken out of the hands of Christianity after the Galileo trial. And after 350 years, people talk about theology of religion, resacralizing the world, and so forth and so on, after we're about to commit suicide. I wish we'd started that several centuries earlier. But nevertheless, there's a Christian theology of nature. Everybody now talks about Hildegard of Bingen, Celtic spirituality, the Irish monks singing to nature, and all of this is coming up. I remember when, in the early 60s, I was writing my book, Man and Nature, to give the Rockwell Series lectures in Chicago. I spent some time here in Cambridge because I knew the Widener Library, the palm of my hand. It was the easiest place for me to do research, and also the Andover Library. And I was trying to find some translation of medieval Irish poetry. I do not know medieval Irish, of some of these beautiful poetry concerning nature. There was not one single work available. I mean, I asked all the Harvard professors. Now you have volume after volume coming out. So it's not that it was absent in Christianity, it was just eclipsed. And then Islam has a very elaborate doctrine of the cosmos. Hinduism, Buddhism, even Buddhism, which talks about samsara, about the world as, in a sense, a flow of suffering, nevertheless, later on developed very elaborate doctrines of the cosmos. And this is a very important subject, which I'm going to conclude in a minute. And then the question of sacred art. One of the greatest compensations in this making the journey across religious frontiers is the encounter with other forms of sacred art. A human being, by inner nature, is attracted to certain forms, certain colors, certain sounds, certain forms of music, or lack thereof. And you have all experienced that in the West. That's the great advantage that modern people in the West have. It's the sign of God's mercy and justice that having had so much taken away, this is given as compensation. That you can not only read the greatest spiritual classics of the world by just going to any bookshop in Harvard Square and having $30 in your pocket. Well, books are more expensive now, but in the old days anyway. But you go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or the Metropolitan Museum, any major American city, and you're able to see some of the greatest works of sacred art of other traditions, other religions. I have many friends here in other cities in the United States and Europe who consider themselves to be philosophically agnostic. They have no interest in religion, but they're religiously passionate about the sacred art of other civilizations. Someone may like a Shiva statue, someone a Sung painting, someone a piece of calligraphy, you name it. But this is one of the remarkable manifestations of the sacred when you cross religious frontiers. Oftentimes it doesn't speak to us. It's one of the last things that speaks to us. For example, Tillich was saying that it was very hard for him at first to appreciate Japanese art. Being a German with the eye trained to see, of course, Western art, but very soon that changed. There are others who have suddenly become passionate about Arabic poetry, about Hindi singing, from Japanese calligraphy, you name it. And the question of sacred art, which is really a kind of manifestation of the heart of the inner reality of religion in the world of forms, is an extremely significant experience of crossing religious frontiers. But again, we cannot absolutize it. There are, for example, Westerners, because in the West, the supreme sacred art was the iconic art of the painting of Christ and the Virgin. Whatever civilization they went to, they looked for that. For example, they found very little painting in Islam. They aggrandized the Persian miniature as the only art. Many courses were taught in this university, and Islamic art we just dealt with the miniature. But that is not the whole of Islamic art. That's much less important than calligraphy, architecture, many other things. But it's natural for human beings to seek what they know. But here again, we are faced with the challenge, the daunting challenge of being able to see what is absolute within a particular tradition, how it corresponds to what is absolute for us, and it's not the absolute. For those who are orthodox, the icons of Christ are absolute in their religious practice in every way. But they're not even the only form of Christian art, not to talk about other things. And finally, and most problematically, the question of us, of the human state, of man in its original sense of umana, not male. And I always use the word man as meaning homo, vir, insan, not the male. The nature of the human being, a man. It is very interesting that although there is, on a certain level, a deep unity of the human family, on another level, there's tremendous diversity. It would be horrible if all human beings were alike. It would be like having a garden only having one flower. And each religion has emphasized this in a different way. For example, Christianity gives a thicker ontological, you might say, status to man than Islam does. Islam emphasized so much the utter nothingness of man before God. But nevertheless, Christianity also has to emphasize humility before God. All Christian music was very humble. All Christian art was that of great humility. When the Renaissance rebelled against medieval art, the first thing was to aggrandize the state of man vis-a-vis God. Now, who is man? What is the understanding of man? Again, that is a very great challenge as you cross religious frontiers, and an honest and sincere scholar is one who does not take a kind of absolute value of what he or she understands man to be across the religious border with him. Now, my time is coming to an end, and I want to conclude by saying there are, I believe, of course there are many, but 6 fundamental consequences that can arise from our crossing the religious frontier in a religious and theological way. The first, that it is possible that there is within us the rise of the need to see our own religion in another context, without sacrificing the sacred, the sense of the sacred within us, and without relativizing it. It's like coming to knowing ourselves better by making a certain kind of friendship. Sometimes when we become very good friends with someone, we come to know ourselves better. And it's a very possible consequence of this entering into another religious world. Secondly, the entering into another religious world, crossing this frontier, could be the occasion and the cause for what we call remembrance of things forgotten. The religion can always forget certain dimension of itself, especially if it's confronted with a great battle, let's say Christianity in the last few centuries. See how weakened the mystical dimension of Christianity became after the 16th century in comparison with other religions of the world. And so there are many young Christians today who go to study Sufism or Zen or some other forms of esoteric inner discipline, and who are not made to become Muslims or Buddhists, but who rediscover through that Christian meditative practices. This has been going on for a long time. You all know Thomas Merton, Johnson, many other people have written on the question of Christianity and you might say techniques of spiritual practice. which for some centuries have been neglected. And this could work the other way around. This could work the other way around. There are many Christians, I'm not talking about governments here, who make a play of human rights when it suits them. If it's Putin killing people in Chechnya, you don't talk about it, but if it's in East Timor, you have big demonstrations. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about their sincere Christians in the West who speak about human rights from a religious point of view, from the point of view that they see man as the image of God and therefore something sacred. Now that is very important for certain Muslims, Hindus, others living in Asia under certain regimes and certain governments with certain restrictions, and they've forgotten this dimension, or they don't emphasize this dimension of their religion as much. So it is not a one-way street. Any person crossing a religious frontier could always find the occasion for a kind of anamnesis in the Platonic sense, a kind of remembrance again, a recollection of things forgotten and lost. Thirdly, and this is especially true for both Christianity and Islam face to face with each other in many ways, and that is the crossing of the religious frontier can cause us to re-examine the role of secularism in determining the context of religion itself. I've had many Christian students, or lukewarm Christian students, who in studying Islam have for the first time become aware what inroads secularism has made into Christianity itself, and even into Christian theology since the 19th century. And this can work across many religious frontiers. Fourthly, and this is a very subtle and metaphysical issue, but some certainly will come to this, this experience of crossing religious frontiers can provide us with a theological and spiritual understanding of the possibility of the different modes of manifestation of the divine. That is, God has more than one face. To see the other faces of God. The Quran oftentimes refers to the face of God, Wajhullah. This is one of the fundamental symbols for the presence of the divine in the Quranic terminology. The face of God is that aspect that the divinity has turned towards us. Now, each religion might be said to be looking at one face of God. But God has more than one face. And ultimately, of course, He's faceless in the sense that He's beyond forms. But when it manifests Himself, or itself, or herself, whatever we want to use, it is always to what we call in Arabic, Wajhullah, the face of God. And it's one of the most profound spiritual experiences for those who are blessed by having it, is to be able to meditate upon different faces of God. That is, different ways in which the divine manifests itself in different universes. And along with this goes the possibility of the development of real love for other theophanies of the divine, and even other manifestations of the divine. It is possible for a Hindu to love Christ. And I have some Hindu friends who went to missionary school in the English period and who learned a lot about Christianity and who are very serious and devout Hindus, but who love Christ, who love the Prophet of Islam, and vice versa. This is always a possibility. It's a challenge, but it's always a possibility. Now, in contrast to all these remarkable positive consequences that this can have, this crossing religious frontier, it can also have a negative consequence, without doubt. That is, the loss of a religious footing, the falling into doubt, the loss of orientation in life, a sense of bewilderment of the meaning of life, and especially of our ethical action, because these various worlds seem to present different types of ethical action, although inwardly it is really always the two great commandments of Christ, to love God and to love the neighbor. But the way they manifest themselves are very, very different. I always say to my students, look at if someone were coming from, let's say, the Confucian world and came to the Abrahamic world. You'd be very surprised that when a Jew and a Muslim go into their house of worship, they put on a hat. When the Christian goes in the house of worship, he takes off his hat. What in the world is going on? They're cousins. But all these mean the same thing. That is, to put on the hat, from one point of view, means humility before God. To take off the hat is also humility, from another point of view. So one can get lost in not being able to distinguish between the formal manifestation, even on the ethical level, and the inner meaning, which in fact is never contradictory. Now, having said all of these, on a more external level, and I want to conclude with that, there's several, at least three domains in which the crossing of religious frontiers is of the utmost significance for our survival as a human family. First of all, as Hans Kung said, I've had many disagreements on many things, but one sentence he said has become famous, I just want to reconfirm. There's no possibility of peace among nations without peace among religions. Finally, the United Nations, after 50 years, is now trying to create an organization this August in which the religious element of humanity will be brought together. It's really communism that prevented that when the UN was first founded, and that's why UNESCO has no R in it. Obviously, you never talk about religion, and you reduce religion to good poetry or philosophy or painting or things like that, and it has had catastrophic consequences. And we know we cannot go on like that. There's the necessity of crossing religious frontiers in order for us to be able to live internationally together. Secondly, a question to which I've devoted a great deal of my energy, and I finally, I think, gotten the ball rolling in this field, you might say, and that is the significance of the importance of the cooperation of religions in the confrontation of the environmental crisis. In a bitter way, I once said that the only act in which all people in the world agree is the destruction of nature. Whether you're a leftist government, rightist government, from the north, from the south, a republic or a monarchy, a democracy or dictatorship, we all agree on one thing: we're destroying the globe very rapidly. A perfect agreement. It's the only thing on which we have perfect agreement, nothing else. But that could be turned into a positive, rather than this pejorative element that I speak about, a positive force, by allowing the various religions to come together in the understanding of nature and to cooperate together. Gradually now, after the Assisi Declaration of the 87, and a number of Catholic and Muslim and Protestant and Jewish theologians have gotten together, and now Hindus and Buddhists, and we're going to several big conferences, one held actually in Norway in November on the question of religion and the environment, to which Dalai Lama will go, and if I have time I will go. I've been invited to go, I don't know whether to go or not, but 5 or 6 other people to speak about this issue. And this issue, of course, is crucial for us. And you cannot have cooperation on such a crucial issue without crossing religious frontiers. It needs an empathy, an understanding of the other's point of view. And one just cannot say, this is my point of view and that's it. There has to be this cooperation. And within the United States, within America itself, unfortunately or fortunately is irrelevant, this the actual reality of the situation. There's need for various religious communities to live together. And there's no way of not crossing religious frontiers. You cannot only follow Puritan ethics. The last bastion of Puritan ethics at Harvard died out a long time ago. There are other forms of ethics that entered into the American scene, but first everybody thought it was Protestant ethics, then Christian ethics, then Judeo-Christian ethics. Now there are 6-7 million Muslims in this country. People talk about Judeo-Christian Islamic ethics. There are 1 million Hindus. There are over 1 million Buddhists, not to talk of the Native Americans who are never counted. And if this society is going to continue as a viable society, there has to be a common ethical norm which people accept. And having police downtown is not enough. You need something more than that. And to do that, within this country, there's more than anywhere else in the world, because it's a kind of microcosm of the whole world, the United States. So many people from so many different nations. There's a necessity of being able to cross religious frontiers in the most sincere way. I do not think it was only accidental, but symbolic, that the great German theologian and philosopher Paul Tillich was to spend the last years of his life here in America rather than Germany. Because I think it will be more than anywhere else in this country, where it's a matter of everyday practical concern, that perhaps the crossing of religious frontiers will finally be taken seriously, and not only as academic practice, both on the level of the academy and in everyday human life. In any case, there is no more important and urgent and no more exciting adventure in the 21st century than to cross religious frontiers with the awareness of what religion means and the diversity that the divine reality has made possible in the manifestation of the forms of the sacred. Thank you.